Winged beasts circled above the castle, where a gaping hole scarred the wall. The hero Bermont and his 4 companions stormed through the corridors toward Count Helmod's domain, determined to vanquish the last of the demon kings. They had already defeated 3 of the 5 kings, only 2 remained. An endless horde of demons blocked their path. Bermont gripped his sword and charged forward. The blade erupted with brilliant light as he swung, triggering a massive explosion. His eyes blazed with power. The great Bermont pressed on. Behind him, the witch raced forward with incredible speed, her staff radiating intense light. A towering flame erupted before her, consuming countless monsters in its path. She smiled at her handiwork. Nearby stood Sia, the priestess. Her hands glowed as she blessed the souls of the fallen. A demon lunged at her from behind, but she spun and severed its head in one clean strike. The headless creature collapsed as she looked on with satisfaction. Saint Anna joined the fray. The warrior raised his axe and cleaved through several enemies with a single devastating blow. Bodies flew across the hall as he grinned at the carnage. The redhead, fearless, sprinted past him. He screamed at his comrade to stop blocking his way. Enemies swarmed ahead, and rage filled his eyes. He tore through them with a series of lightning-fast attacks, his face twisted in fury. Then he sheathed his weapon. The group stood in the center of the hall. Fearless glanced around. Fewer enemies remained. Suddenly, he called out to the blonde. Something was approaching Bermont, but the redhead threw himself in the way. Blood poured from his mouth. A demon laughed as a massive wound opened in the redhead's chest. He crumpled to the ground. The monster prepared another attack, arm outstretched. Bermont dodged and closed the distance, slashing the demon in half. Blood sprayed across the floor. The others rushed to their wounded companion. Bermont sheathed his weapon and stood with his head bowed. This shouldn't be how it ends. Fearless smiled weakly. This was a dignified death. In his final moments, he deeply regretted never being honest with his comrades. With a trembling hand, he reached out, asking them to finish what they started to kill all the demon kings. His friend grasped his hand, looking into his eyes. He swore in the name of the hero that he would destroy every last demon king. Hearing this brought the dying man peace. The priestess clasped her hands together. The boy asked her to pray for him. The warrior looked on with grief. The dying man told him he was the bravest person he'd ever known. Senel wept. He looked at her, wanting to tell her the truth. Then a leg appeared. The boy stomped on the book. He shouted that he'd never liked it. Shaking his fist, he declared that no matter how many times he read it, it always made him furious. Who wrote this garbage? If he ever found the author, he'd beat them senseless. He picked up the book casually. Not only that, but they gave everyone cool nicknames: great, wise, holy, fearless. But why did they call him Rash HL? Was this written by someone he'd beaten up 300 years ago? He tossed the book aside. What about his team? Why did they ignore such a ridiculous book? Why didn't they defend their brother in arms' honor? The blonde remembered the death scene, questioning whether they'd considered the possibility of the hero's reincarnation with all his past memories intact. He frowned. HL had died 300 years ago during the war against the 5 demon kings. The hero looked away. A painting hung on the wall depicting a warrior with a sword, reincarnation in the body of one of the hero's descendants. He studied the picture. Vujan, 13 years old. Bermont had been surrounded by women besides his first wife. He'd kept numerous concubines. The boy put on training gear. He didn't remember Bermont chasing women. Had his views changed with age? That was natural for people. He imagined the family tree. Only the children of his first wife were considered direct descendants of Bermont. Despite sharing the surname, Eugene was only a descendant of a side branch. He picked up the training sword. Children of the side branches were forbidden from training in magic or using real swords until after the blood inheritance ritual. He looked at the weapon. That's why he made do with this wooden toothpick. but today was the last day he'd hold it. He swung and struck the dummy repeatedly. With another powerful swing, the dummy shattered. One piece clattered to the ground. A man stood behind him, noting with concern that he'd destroyed another dummy. The boy turned. It was his father. Veins bulged across his body. His father looked at him strangely. How could such a physique belong to a 13-year-old? Honestly, if they fought right now, he doubted he could win. The boy stared at his father menacingly. Eugene was his own son, but sometimes he frightened him. His speech and mannerisms weren't childish. Those unsettling eyes held no trace of innocence. Though he'd lost his mother at a young age, there hadn't been a single day of sadness. Lujin kicked the dummy's base, noting that their blacksmith was incompetent. The boy's face reddened. How dare he take money for such trash? He should be punished, but his father was too merciful. The man cleared his throat. He'd give the blacksmith a stern reprimand. Sunlight illuminated the house walls. Tomorrow would be the blood inheritance ritual. The boy looked at him indifferently. The blood inheritance ritual, a terrible tradition held every decade. People wore the lion coat of arms. All children between 10 and 15 from both main and side branches gathered at the main family's house to participate. The children demonstrated their skills, then competed for the right to bear the Lionheart name. Eugene leaned on his wooden sword. Unlike the side branches, direct descendants were allowed to train in magic and use real weapons. This was only done so those weaklings from the main branch wouldn't die at the hands of the side branch's children. His father looked at the destroyed mannequin. Eugene's talent was so extraordinary he could barely recognize his son in it. If only he'd been born into the main family. He looked at his trembling hand. No, if he'd been as talentless as his father, he wouldn't have to feel the gap between reality and his abilities. The boy noticed his distress and asked what was wrong. He said everything was fine. Inside, he probably thought himself a terrible father. The man placed his hands on the boy's shoulders and looked into his eyes. He told Eugene never to cross paths with the main branch's children. No matter how gifted he was, he couldn't match them since they'd been trained in magic from an early age and wielded real weapons. The boy patted his hand, saying he understood, but he thought otherwise. Only in dreams would he avoid them. He smiled imperceptibly. It was just a fight with a bunch of children. Disgustingly tedious. Eugene approached another mannequin. The blood inheritance ritual involved 3 children from the main branch and 6 from the side branches. He listed them. The 3 from the main family included the son of the head of the family's first wife and twins from his concubine. Except for 2 children from respected side branches, everyone else was nobody. The boy raised his sword and shattered the dummy with one blow. The hero smiled ominously, wondering how good Bermont's descendants really were. The carriage departed through the estate gate. Eugene looked out the window. As HL in his past life, he'd considered himself a true genius. He'd beaten other children in fights since childhood. He'd mastered new skills effortlessly and developed far faster than others. HL frowned, telling him to repeat what he'd said. Bermont crossed his arms. He said it was very sad. The redhead could become much stronger with a little more effort. He pointed to his sword. Couldn't he see he was already fighting at his limit, giving everything? Sweat ran down his face. Not everyone had the same talent. He wasn't a genius like Bermont, who could truly be called one. The blonde remained impassive. Gifted in both swordsmanship and magic, he was called the God of War, the Great Bermont. The crowd admired him. He was a duke in his homeland, but refused the title until the end. He was praised as a warrior. The boy rested his head on his hand. But what about the others? The witch stood before the tower. The wise Senya, born in the kingdom of magicians, became the youngest master in the magic tower's history. Monks bowed before the priestess, Saint Anna. This woman was considered the holiest person in the entire Holy Empire. There was even scripture describing her teachings. The warrior stood wearing a crown. The fearless unthinkable, he'd founded a kingdom named after himself. He tapped his finger. They all lived happily until their deaths. Angrily, he struck the armrest. So why was the Demon King still alive? The boy remembered his death, how his comrade had promised to kill all the Demon Kings. A dove flew past the carriage. He died in the magical imprisonment castle, and immediately after his death, that blonde man made a contract with the Demon King. Birds flew behind the carriage. Thanks to that contract, the war with demons ended. Even after 300 years, peace reigned in these lands. A man addressed him, saying he seemed nervous. He smiled broadly and winked. Upon arrival, he'd have a difficult time. Since he was already worrying in the carriage, Eugene should relax. Eugene thanked Lord Gordon for his guidance as he left. The carriage moved through the forest. They were in the main house's territory. The Lord shook his head. This didn't mean they'd arrive soon. The estate was still far away. Eugene didn't understand why he was showing off. Wasn't managing such vast territory problematic? The man replied that several portals made everything manageable. He replayed their dialogue in his head. Why ride in a carriage if portals existed? They weren't given permission to use them. That amused him. The horses walked in sync. Gordon pointed to the gate. "Welcome to the Patriarch's estate." The boy frowned as they proceeded along the avenue. He smiled a welcoming ceremony, clearly not prepared for him. Banners fluttered along the road. A shield with a lion on a blue background. Eugene placed his hand on his chest. Only descendants of the main branch were allowed to wear the lion crest on the left side of their chest. The Lord gestured no one else had arrived yet. He was first. Now he should be escorted to the guest house. Sunlight bathed the estate. The maid bowed and introduced herself as Na. She would attend to all their needs while they were guests. She handed him a bell if they needed anything. They should ring it. She placed it on the table. At least he had a personal maid assigned. The boy sat on the bed, noticing she looked quite young. How old was she? 16. She'd just recently graduated. Eugene thought about it. They'd given him an incompetent servant. If the inexperienced servant caused problems, they'd simply shift blame onto him. Whoever came up with this idea clearly wanted to spite the hero. The boy folded his arms. He asked when the others would arrive. She answered within the next 4 days. He got out of bed and asked her to take him to the training ground. The girl looked confused but agreed. A fountain stood in the courtyard. The boy had a lion on the right side of his chest. He asked again for the name. The girl with the same lion quietly answered Nujan. He was their age. Children stood by the wall. The boy heard he was from a small provincial town west of the empire. "I'm sure he's more used to a rake than a sword." He held his nose. His carriage smelled of vile animal excrement. This guy might be their age, but he'd take responsibility if he damaged their property. The girl laughed. "That's right, he should be punished." The boy looked proud. They wouldn't punish him, just warn him. He was too merciful. She agreed. Another boy watched through the window. She turned to look at him. He got scared and pulled the curtain. She smiled. Eugene trained on the field, holding a wooden spear. He lunged and raised it, continuing to practice his attack. He was never lazy with training, but in this life he had to try much harder. The boy lunged, swinging the spear. No matter how much he tortured his body, he never suffered illness, and most wounds healed within a day. He gripped the weapon tightly. Dust flew from his swing as he practiced another attack. The abilities of a body carrying Bermont's blood exceeded all expectations. Eugene thrust forward. The servant watched, amazed. Even with sandbags and a heavy spear, he moved so deftly. Suddenly she was called out. 2 children approached. The boy asked what he was doing. The maid grew scared, asking what brought them. He pointed at the boy with the spear, reminding her he'd asked the question, what was he doing here? There was a blow to the ground. Eugene held the spear. What couldn't they see? He was training. He continued training, cursing. His sister whispered in his ear, saying he'd insulted him. Cyan's face twisted with rage. He shouted, "How dare he!" He shook his fist, demanding an apology. Eugene showed no emotion and simply apologized. The boy didn't know how to react. He shook his fist again, accusing him of being insincere. He should bow and show sincerity. Weren't they the same age? The boy sighed. Why should he bow to appear? He waved his arms. How dare he call him a friend? Just because they shared a last name didn't make them equals. The sister turned to her brother, reminding him about the carriage. Cyan pointed at his opponent, telling him to wash the carriage he'd arrived in. Surely it reeked of the animals he herded. Eugene looked without interest. He turned to the servant, clarifying she was his personal maid. She agreed. He pointed to the side, telling her to clean the carriage he'd arrived in. She rushed off. The boy in the dark jacket grew angry. He'd said this to him. How dare he shift duties to a servant when he'd given the order personally? The boy clutched his chest, showing he didn't respect his orders. He was Saiyan Lujin. Waved kindly, introducing himself. It was a pleasure to meet him. The girl waved and introduced herself as Cell. This angered her brother. He'd ignored his orders, meaning he could show no mercy. He saw the training sword and picked it up. Holding it before him, he declared that for the insult, he challenged him to a duel. Eugene smiled. The children stood opposite each other. He noted how rash it was to use the word duel. He put his hand to his head, suggesting they just part ways. But was he scared? The boy looked at him. The boy with the sword grinned. Afraid of him? In that case, he should bow and beg for forgiveness. Eugene spread his hands. What made him think he was scared? He didn't want to fight or apologize. Cyan pointed his finger. I don't want this, I don't want that. Had he decided to run away? It seemed his parents hadn't explained the meaning of honor. A weight fell to the ground. The parent looked confused, but he'd challenged him to a duel. He threw away another weight, telling him to throw down his glove. He removed his chainmail and threw it away. It fell heavily. Cyan grew scared. The guy had been training with such heavy bags all along. It seemed he'd just been showing off. Eugene removed the bag from his spear. His sister looked on with delight. He'd challenged him himself. If he retreated now, the girl would laugh at him forever. The boy took out a handkerchief. He needed to defend his honor. He threw it to the ground, challenging Eugene to a duel. The handkerchief floated down. The bag fell heavily from the spear. He looked at his opponent and accepted the challenge. Cell was surprised. The boy struck hard with the spear. The blow made him drool. He watched silently. The blow made him lose his sword and fall to the ground. Eugene held the spear. He'd won. The sister ran to her brother, asking if he was okay. He tried to breathe but vomited. The girl looked angrily at the boy and began complaining. This was cowardice. There was no honor in this duel. Eugene folded his arms. What cowardice was she talking about? According to the rules, the duel begins the moment the handkerchief touches the ground. It was his own fault for losing vigilance. She pointed her finger. That was true, but he'd been using mana in training, hadn't he? The boy tossed the spear aside. No children from side branches were forbidden to master mana until the blood inheritance ceremony. She accused him of lying. Without mana, he could never swing such a heavy weapon so easily. Cell frowned. His attack was so fast that even if her brother had been fully prepared, there was no way he could have blocked it. Eugene smiled, putting his hand to his chin. It seemed her eyes weren't just for show. She frowned, noting he had a long tongue. People often told him that. He returned to the duel's moment. It wasn't that her brother did nothing. When his spear nearly reached him, he'd instinctively dashed back to reduce damage. Considering his limited real battle experience, This was surprising. Eugene lowered his eyebrows. The opponent had great potential, but was far from being called a descendant of Bermont. Saiyan stood up, clutching his chest, calling him a coward. Eugene laughed. They really were twins, even spoke the same. He walked closer to the loser. The man's mouth was covered in vomit. If he considered himself a worthy descendant of the family, he should admit defeat with honor. He turned away. The victor folded his arms. Maybe he should have held back. If he did this to a main line member, they'd hardly turn a blind eye. A man walked toward them, his face tense. The hero looked at him. No lion emblem on his chest, just a knight. However, his strength was undeniable. He looked impressive. The child burst into tears, burying his face in Hazar. He'd lost to a country bumpkin. His face turned red. He'd challenged him to a duel and lost. The man thought about it, looking at the boy. He bowed and apologized for not introducing himself immediately. His name was Hazar. He was responsible for training Saiyan. The boy looked at him and replied his name was Eugene, from the city of Gaul. The girls stood further away. As far as the teacher knew, the Gerard family was located in that city. This was the boy's father. He looked into the boy's eyes, asking what happened. The boy met his gaze. Saiyan had challenged him to a duel and insulted his father. The boy next to the man looked worried, saying it wasn't true. He continued his father allegedly hadn't taught him honor, then called him a coward. This meant he'd insulted not only him but also his father. How could he think this wasn't reason to accept a duel? The man thought about it. He began leading the boy away, offering to tend his wounds. The girl waved goodbye, as her hoped to see him soon. He waved back. Later, he ate at the table. The maid held notes. He saw she'd returned. She was looking at him about his assignment. Young Masters Deacon Hansen Jules would arrive at noon. Gary's Desira would arrive this evening through the portal. He took a bite of meat. They'd gather earlier than expected. The ritual would begin very soon. The guy left the house. Sunlight illuminated the red carpet. Bermont raised his head. He was going to beat his descendants. He hoped he wouldn't be too upset. He raised his fist. He hadn't wanted to be reborn as his own descendant. He smiled. Saiyan stood before the girl. The boy looked down, confused. The brown-haired woman closed her fan, asking if her son had challenged a boy from a side branch to a fight and lost. The second wife of the main family, Anila Isar, lowered his head, confirming it was so. Anila looked at her son with a slight smile, telling him to come closer. Saiyan walked toward his mother with a guilty expression. The brown-haired woman poked the fan into the boy's chest. Anila looked at her son with a malicious smile, asking if he couldn't dodge this either. Saiyan said it hurt. The brown-haired woman looked down with a malicious expression, telling him to stand still. The girl looked at the man, calling out to him. She looked at Hazar with a menacing expression, asking if the boy really hadn't used magic. The teacher looked nervously at the floor. He confirmed it. He was Gerard's son, and there wasn't a drop of magical energy in his body. Cell looked at her mother in surprise. The brunette asked her daughter how it happened that her brother lost. Cell looked at Anila with a calm expression. As soon as the duel began, Eugene immediately struck him with a spear, completely surprising Saiyan. Her brother tried to get up, but Eugene's spear was faster. Anila looked at Cell with a displeased expression, asking if victory was determined by one blow. Saiyan frowned, looking at the floor. He looked at his mother guiltily. Anila struck her son across the face. She looked at him with an enraged expression, asking how he could lose a duel he himself started and in front of the mob to some boy the same age who didn't even own magic. Anila looked straight ahead with anger. She said their father would burn with shame at the blood ritual. How would he look him in the eye? She could already imagine how Fuse would mock her. Saiyan, with tears in his eyes, asked his mother for forgiveness. Anila looked at Hazari with irritation, calling out to him. she burned him with her evil gaze. The brunette said she'd gladly finish him off, but fortunately for him, her husband valued him highly. She ordered him to intensify the training Cyan should not lose face again. The brunette waved her hand to the side, telling the teacher to take Cyan away. Cyan, with tears in his eyes, left with Hazar. The brunette stood with her back to the door. Anila opened her fan and covered her face with it, sighing heavily. Anila looked out from under the fan. She looked at her daughter with a serious expression, turning to her. The brunette smiled slightly, asking if the boy's name was Eugene. She should try to get closer to him. Cell looked at her mother with bewilderment, asking why. The brunette said he was already strong enough to defeat her brother. Anila looked ahead with a sly expression. She thought that if she had her way, she'd kill him right then, but she'd be the first suspect. Anila imagined warriors. She noted that if there was discord within the family, the defenders of family traditions would intervene, and their interference should be avoided at all costs. The brunette raised her index finger, telling her to watch him carefully. The girl looked at her mother with a smile, agreeing she'd also like to learn more about him. Anila slightly narrowed her gaze, smiling slightly. Eugene noted that the next day, 3 children from the side branches arrived at the main family's estate. 3 boys stood next to each other: Deacon, years old; Hanson, 14 years old; Giles, 10 years old. The protagonist ran with weights, sweat streaming down his face from intense training. The maid looked at the protagonist with excitement, calling out to him. The protagonist stopped, looking at the girl. Na said they'd already arrived. Eugene asked what she meant. 2 from their side branches, they were a bit early since she'd said to expect them in the evening. Na looked at the boy in shock, saying the head of the family had arrived with them. The protagonist looked at the maid with a serious expression, thinking about the head of the Lionheart family. Na waved her hand anxiously, saying he should quickly go meet him. He should change his clothes first. Eugene said he'd be late alone. He wiped his face with a towel, saying it was okay, he'd go straight like this. Knights and many people lined up near the gate. The protagonist glanced to the side. A brown-haired woman stood next to her children with a smile. Eugene noted that the woman next to Cyan and Cell was Anila, the second wife. The woman looked straight ahead with a menacing expression. Eugene noted that in front must be the first wife, Theonis, and that guy. The boy looked ahead with an anxious expression. The protagonist noted this was the eldest son of the main family, the first in the line of succession Ed Lionheart. Silhouettes appeared before the gate. A man sat on a horse with a guy behind him. The man looked ahead with a menacing expression, Gilead Lionheart. The guy looked ahead with a slight smile. Eugene wondered if this was Jan, the younger brother behind him. Yod looked at the ground with an anxious expression. Dade approached his son with a smile, saying he'd grown taller. Had his strength also increased? Yod lowered his gaze, saying he'd try to live up to his expectations. Gilead glared at the boy. He turned his attention to Anila. Gilead spread his arms to the sides, smiling at the children. Children grew up so fast. Cell said they'd been bored. The head of the family looked at the man with a smile, calling him Guilford. He pressed his palm to his chest and smiled slightly. Gilead said he'd heard he had a son, apologizing for not being with him at that happy moment. Guilford looked at the head of the family with excitement. Gilead turned his attention to the children, saying these must be children from lateral families. The head of the family extended his hand to the side, suggesting they eat together. Gilead looked straight ahead, saying they'd also discuss the blood ritual. The children and the head of the family gathered around the table. Gilead sat next to his descendants. The protagonist sat opposite with the other children. The girl and boy sat with serious faces, Gargis and Desira. The protagonist looked to the side, thinking they'd come to the ceremony using the portal together with the head. Their families must be the most noble among the side branches. The blonde smiled sweetly, closing his eyes. Eugene wondered who he was. Should only ritual participants be present at the dinner? Cell turned her attention to the blonde. She looked at her father with curiosity, asking who it was. Gilead pointed at the boy, saying he actually wanted to introduce their guest a little later. The blonde said it was possible at that moment. Eugene looked attentively at the blonde, sipping tea. The boy smiled widely, extending his palms. He greeted them, saying he was Ryan from the Red Tower. The children looked at the blonde man in shock, wondering if this was Ryan. Yod looked at Ryan in shock. Eugene spat out his tea. Yod said he was the leader of the Red Magic Tower. Eugene grabbed his chest. Roverin looked at the protagonist worriedly, asking if he was okay. Eugene said everything was fine. The protagonist thought perplexed. He was the leader of the Red Magic Tower, meaning he was Senya's disciple, or more precisely, the disciple of previous disciples. Eugene recalled how Senya conjured over books. He noted that 300 years ago, Senya was the youngest in the history of the main Green Tower of Arrow. She'd updated all the magic grimoires, consulted students, and even the heads of other magic towers. Eugene introduced the head of the Green Tower, Ram. He noted that even now, the head of the Green Tower and Ryan, the head of the Red Tower, considered the wise Senya their great mentor. Gilead stared at the protagonist. Eugene thought he didn't expect to meet someone connected to his old past there. Eugene looked at the head of the family in surprise. Gilead asked if his name was Eugene. He'd heard about him from Thews. Gilead looked at the boy with a serious expression, noting she'd said his son insulted Eugene and his father. Cyan pressed his lips together in fear, looking at the floor. The protagonist looked at Gilead with a serious expression, saying everything was true, but he held no grudge. The head of the family looked at the boy menacingly, saying it was because he'd won the fight. Eugene clenched his hand into a fist. He said even if he'd lost, nothing would have changed. If he was so weak he couldn't defend his honor, he'd have no choice but to accept these insults. The head of the family smirked contentedly, saying he was better than his son. Cyan sat with a frightened expression. The head of the family looked at his son with disappointment. He said he wasn't ashamed of his defeat, but it was sad to see how cowardly he was, hiding his gaze. Cyan looked at the floor, dumbfounded. The boys watched intently. Gilead told his son he'd started that fight by insulting Eugene, but after losing, he hadn't even apologized. Cyan looked at his father in bewilderment. Gilead looked at his son with a serious expression. He said he was Lionheart, a descendant of the great Vermont. If his blood truly flowed in his veins, he should respect not only his own honor, but also the honor of others. Cyan looked at the protagonist in confusion. He blushed slightly, reluctantly asking Eugene for forgiveness. The protagonist bared his teeth in displeasure, thinking the apology was obviously insincere. Gilead looked at the protagonist with a menacing expression, asking if his father was Gerard. He apologized, saying he didn't know him personally. The protagonist looked at the head of the family seriously. He said that was correct, adding he also believed their family lived in the wilderness. A huge chandelier hung overhead. Gilead asked if his father was in charge of his training. Eugene said he'd laid the foundation, but then he'd begun training on his own. Desira looked at the boy in surprise, wondering why he trained alone without a mentor. Gargis looked away with disdain, wondering why he'd managed to defeat Saiyan. Gilead smiled contentedly, saying it seemed there'd be something to see at the ritual this time. The maids entered, bringing food. They began placing plates before the boys. Beautiful food covered the table. The head of the family smiled, extending his hand. He said he didn't know if they'd like it, but they were probably hungry, they should dig in. The full moon shone above the mansion. The maids collected empty plates. The boys sat at the empty table again. Gilead wiped his mouth with a handkerchief. He noted that, as he'd said before, this dinner was organized to tell them about the blood ritual. The boys looked at Gilead with excitement, while Eugene remained calm. Sel and Cyan looked at their father attentively. Gilead said that although it sounded strange coming from the head of the family, he believed the tradition put participants in an extremely unequal position. The head of the family presented the lion crest. He said it only benefited the descendants of the direct line, since until the ritual's beginning, the children of side branches couldn't use either real weapons or magic. Gilead imagined a duel between children, saying this naturally deprived them of any chance of winning. Yod looked at his father with excitement. Gilead said this time 3 of his children would participate in the ritual. The head of the family looked at the children with a serious expression. He'd like not only them but all Lionheart children to demonstrate their abilities. The meaning of this ritual was to prove they were worthy of being called descendants of the great Vermont, whether from the direct line or not. The protagonist lowered his head, thinking of Vermont. He looked out from under his bangs with a satisfied grin, thinking his descendant was much kinder than him. Gilead pointed at Roan with a smile, saying this time they'd have help from an outsider. Roan said that's why he was there. The blonde snapped his fingers. A blue labyrinth appeared on the table. Roan pointed at the labyrinth with a smile. He said at this blood ritual, they'd enter a labyrinth he'd created. Each would enter through their own entrance, and their task was to defeat the main monster in the center. Roverin pointed at the monster. Naturally, to reach it, they'd have to go through traps and other monsters. The blonde picked up the monster figurine. He told them not to forget this was nothing more than an illusion he'd created, so everything they encountered was unreal, just a figment of their imagination. The blonde smiled wickedly, breaking the figurine. However, the sensations would be no different from the real thing. The protagonist grinned contentedly, thinking he'd use not only summoning magic but also high-level classics. It wasn't for nothing he was the head of the magic tower. The blonde introduced the victorious monster. He said as soon as one of them defeated the main monster, the ritual ended. Everyone would be awarded points depending on their performance. Hansen looked at Roan excitedly, asking if it was okay if they couldn't get out of the labyrinth. Roran smiled awkwardly. He said of course if they got scared, they could just stay at the starting point. But they wouldn't earn a high score. The protagonist looked at the head of the tower with curiosity. Eugene asked what they'd get for defeating that main monster. The head of the family grinned contentedly, closing his eyes. He looked at Eugene with a slight grin. Gilead said the winner could take whatever they wanted from their underground treasury. The protagonist smiled happily, blushing slightly. Eugene walked down the corridor, looking straight ahead with a sly grin. He'd win the ritual anyway, so he should think in advance about what to take from the underground treasury. The protagonist looked ahead in bewilderment. Garis and Desira met him on the way. Garis looked at Eugene with an arrogant expression, crossing his arms. He asked if Eugene really defeated Cyan. The protagonist looked at the guy with an indifferent expression, confirming he did. Eugene walked past the guys, waving his hand. He said if that was all they wanted to ask, he was leaving. Garis extended his hand toward Eugene, looking at his sister in confusion. The protagonist trained under the night sky. He swung the wooden sword skillfully. Eugene's eyes flashed as he swung, raising clouds of dust with his blow. The protagonist looked behind him where Garu and Desira stood. Desira held wooden spears. The protagonist looked at them in bewilderment, not understanding what they were doing there. Garis confidently walked toward Eugene. He clenched his hands, standing next to the protagonist. The guy removed his shirt with a sharp jerk. He took a deep breath, putting his hands before him. He tensed the muscles across his body. The protagonist looked at him in confusion, widening his eyes. An idiot. The guy patted his chest, saying he could touch it. Eugene said he'd probably refuse. Garu bragged about his body, saying their family had a secret technique for developing muscles passed down through generations. The guy imagined pumped-up men. He said they used a special drug that accelerated muscle growth without accumulating mana. There were no side effects. Garu put his hands behind his head, asking if Eugene was interested. The protagonist asked if he'd come there to sell pills. No side effects? Desira walked toward the protagonist with spears, saying the drug made both girls and guys grow beards. The girl looked at the protagonist with a serious expression. She noted they said he'd defeated Cyan with a spear, asking why he now had a wooden sword. The protagonist threw the sword over his shoulder, saying he was proficient with both spear and sword. Desira asked what he meant by being skilled with any weapon. She threw the spear toward Eugene. He quickly grabbed it. Desira stood ready for battle, saying the spear was her strong point. What did he think about sparring? Eugene looked away thoughtfully. This girl was clearly a more interesting opponent than that dealer. The protagonist smiled slightly, thinking he was also curious how the children from noble side branches would perform in battle. Eugene told Desira he agreed. The boys took up fighting positions. Eugene looked at Garu, asking what he was doing there. The guy said he'd be the judge. Gargus closed his eyes and raised his hand. Even though this was sparring, everything should be fair. The protagonist imagined with bewilderment this idiot reminded him of someone. Was he by any chance? Desira looked at her brother with displeasure. Gargus said they could begin. Desira said she understood, hurrying him. Desira looked ahead irritably. He owned both sword and spear. Ridiculous. The girl bared her teeth angrily. She'd show him only those who devoted themselves to it could skillfully wield a spear. Faris lowered his hand, shouting the command to begin. The girl moved from her place, either victory or death. She suddenly widened her eyes. Desira abruptly stopped. A powerful aura emanated from the protagonist. The protagonist's eyes expressed confidence. Desira thought he was holding the line. The protagonist looked at the girl in bewilderment, asking what was wrong. Desira bared her teeth, opened her mouth, and rushed to attack Eugene. The protagonist parried the attack with his spear. Eugene continued to stand motionless. Desira gritted her teeth and attacked again. Eugene blocked the blow. Desira looked at the protagonist with displeasure. The protagonist again and again parried the girl's attacks. Eugene carefully watched each blow, thinking she was good at fighting without using magic. Her abilities could become truly limitless in the future. The protagonist grinned maliciously. She wasn't his rival for now. Eugene parried the girl's attack again. He smiled maliciously, asking sarcastically why she couldn't hit him. Desira bared her teeth angrily. Why was he going to parry her attacks while standing in one place? This self-confidence would be his undoing. The girl swung her spear, rushing toward Eugene. The protagonist continually blocked the blows. Desira suddenly jumped to the side, appearing behind the protagonist. Desira smiled slightly. He wouldn't be able to block her blow from there. Desira rushed to attack the protagonist. Eugene raised his foot above the spear and stepped on it, pressing it to the ground with all his might. Desira tried to retrieve the spear, gritting her teeth. The protagonist's spear appeared before her face. Eugene held the spear before Desira's face, blocking her weapon. Garis, with a surprised face, said the winner was Eugene Lionheart. Gargus crossed his arms, looking at the protagonist. They should unite. The protagonist lay in bed, looking at the guy with bewilderment. Eugene frowned in irritation, asking why he'd woken him just for this. Garis looked confidently at the protagonist. He needed his answer. Lujin raised his hand. He'd heard what the head of the family said about the ritual everyone enters through their own entrance. How was he going to do it? The guy imagined the monster and twins. The entrances are different, but the final goal is the center of the labyrinth, the main monster. The twins were also going to unite. Eugene looked at the guy indifferently, asking what he was proposing to meet in the center of the labyrinth and destroy the main monster together. The guy confirmed exactly that. Eugene squeezed his hand, saying he thought he could handle it himself. Desira said he was an idiot. Eugene looked at Desira by the wall. The girl awkwardly looked away, saying he was strong. With his help, they'd definitely defeat the main monster. The girl moved from the wall. Eugene asked why she wanted it so much. The protagonist looked at Desira with a serious expression. The girl said every time children from direct and lateral branches participated in the blood ritual simultaneously, none of the latter had ever won. Desira approached her brother, telling Eugene they could do it, she, Garis, and him. Desira looked at Eugene with a serious expression, asking if he didn't want to defeat the main family. Eugene looked at the girl with a confident expression. Anila stood by the window, imagining Rorin with an evil look. Anila thought perhaps the head of the magic tower invited to participate came to take Yod as his apprentice. Anila remembered how little Yod was interested in books and magic. She noted that since childhood, he'd had a passion for reading rather than physical training. He was interested in magic and had even managed to learn something. The girl imagined Rorin taking Yod and his children. She noted if Yod became the apprentice of the head of the Red Magic Tower, he'd have to leave his family. In other words, this would give Cyan and Cell more space to grow, and the boy would effectively lose his chances of inheriting. The brown-haired girl looked menacingly ahead. The whole problem was in the ritual. Anasila imagined herself with children and mocking people. She thought if her children didn't pass it, they'd bear the stigma of shame for the rest of their lives. Up until then, she'd always managed to stand firmly on her feet and achieve everything she wanted. Anila nervously squeezed her fan. She'd lose to a child from some side branch. The brown-haired girl angrily clenched her fists. If this bastard was the first to exit the labyrinth. Anila introduced Eugene with a displeased face. She thought if he managed to humiliate the main family because of his overly outstanding abilities, then Cyan's defeat wouldn't be so noticeable against the general background. 3 days later, Roverin and the guys stood near the portal. The blood ritual had finally begun. Rorin gathered blue energy in his hands. Blue spheres emerged from the magical energy. The spheres landed in the twins' hands, then appeared in the guy's hands as well. Robert smiled slightly, raising his finger. The first thing he'd do was create equipment for them. Each should imagine the weapon they needed and form it out of light. The boys clutched the spheres in their hands in surprise. Cell confidently created a sword from the sphere, looking at her weapon happily. Cell began swinging her sword. Roan closed his eyes and smiled awkwardly. The girl asked what to do if the sword broke. Roan said it was impossible. It, like the labyrinth, was created with magic. Cell looked at her sword in surprise, asking if animals could also be created. The tower leader said puppets and even golems could be created, but not living creatures. Yod looked at the tower leader in bewilderment, asking why. The tower leader smiled broadly, raising his finger. Doing so was forbidden in the world of magic. Only higher powers could create new life. Yod looked at the tower leader with interest. Garu created a two-handed sword, throwing it over his shoulder while looking at his sister. Garis said it was his favorite sword, the one he used at home during training, only now it wasn't wooden. It was surprising how it materialized exactly as he'd imagined. Desira asked who he was telling this to, since no one asked. Desira created a spear in her hands. Cyan created a sword in his hands. Yod looked at the sword in his hands with a downcast expression. The boys looked at the swords in their hands in confusion. The protagonist created a small sword and shield. Cell looked at the protagonist, asking what he'd do if they met in the labyrinth. Cell tilted her head to the side, asking if he'd fight her. The protagonist looked at the head of the family, asking if that was okay. The head of the family said there were no rules inside the labyrinth. After all, competition was the basis of the ritual. Gilead pressed his palm to his chest and smiled slightly. The head of the family said this time, depending on circumstances, they'd have to demonstrate their analytical skills and ability to work as a team, because they were all members of the same Lionheart family. Cell looked at the protagonist with embarrassment, thinking about one family. The girl grinned maliciously, looking at Eugene. The protagonist looked at the girl with bewilderment, thinking he felt somehow uneasy. The head of the tower began taking out a pendant from the magic circle. He asked if everyone had created a weapon, noting they now needed to put it around their necks. Roran began handing out pendants to the boys. The boys looked at the blue pendant in surprise. The head of the tower said this pendant would establish a connection with their minds. If they reached a critical level of stress in the labyrinth, it would react. The head of the tower looked at the boys with a serious expression. He'd intervene if the situation got out of control. The protagonist looked at the pendant around his neck, wondering if this was a precaution against unexpected incidents. The tower leader opened his mouth wide and tapped his chest. If they felt unable to get out of the labyrinth, they should knock on the stone on the pendant and shout "help," then they'd be able to leave easily. Roran pointed to the portal, saying he was done with explanations. Now they should all calmly enter the cave together. Roan looked at the guys with a sly smile. The head of the tower said there was one entrance, but everyone had a different path. The guys confidently approached the cave. Cell smiled broadly and waved her hand to Eugene, wishing him good luck. The protagonist wished her good luck in return. Eugene ran into the portal, emerging on the other side of the cave. A huge dark corridor appeared before him. The protagonist remembered going through it with his team before. In his past life, he'd gone through many such labyrinths. Lujin raised his head, looking at the ceiling. It would be impossible to climb up since the walls reached the ceiling. The protagonist swung his sword before him. The sword barely touched the wall. Eugene looked at the sword with a serious expression. Plus, you couldn't really turn around because of them. It would be inconvenient with a long weapon. The protagonist looked at his weapon with satisfaction. This is why he'd chosen a sword and shield, a basic combination that worked well in almost any situation. Eugene looked slightly ahead. Obviously, a labyrinth created for children should be easy. The protagonist moved from his place. It was time to go. Slimes with malicious smiles flew straight ahead. Deacon swung his sword at the slimes in fear, fell to the ground, and began hitting the crystal, asking for help. Roran appeared next to Deacon in the labyrinth, pressing his palm to it and teleporting him out. The head of the family thought less than an hour had passed since the beginning of the blood ritual, but 3 had already escaped from the labyrinth. Hansen, Deacon, and Giles stood with guilty looks. Gilead looked at the boys with a menacing expression, frowning in irritation. He told them to go inside and rest. The boys looked sadly at the ground. Gilead and Roran watched the boys on the spheres. Gilead looked thoughtfully at the spheres. Garis swung his 2-handed sword at the goblins. He frowned, preparing to attack. His huge sword got stuck in the wall. The goblin looked at the sword with a malicious smile. Gars opened his mouth wide. He broke the wall with his sword. With a strong swing, he cut off the goblins' heads. The goblins immediately evaporated. The boy looked confidently ahead. Gilead thought Gars was walking toward his goal awkwardly but persistently, easily dealing with all the monsters he encountered on his way. His aura was visible on the sphere. Malicious slimes appeared before the girl, Desira. Desira deftly dodged the slime's attacks, piercing one with her spear. The girl gritted her teeth in displeasure. It was hard to use a spear against slimes. She had to wait for the moment. Desira ran straight ahead, looking back at her opponents. She looked confidently ahead. Gilead thought Desira was smart and her intuition was correct. She saw no need to fight monsters because it was more important to get out of the labyrinth. Cyan was visible on the sphere. A wall with holes appeared before him. Cyan remembered studying papers with a sly grin. Before the ritual, his mother had managed to find several drawings of different labyrinths. After studying them, they'd developed a behavior tactic. Now neither he nor Cell would fall into such obvious traps. Cyan picked up a small stone from the floor and threw it toward the wall. From the flying stone, arrows began appearing from the wall. After the arrows ran out, the boy ran on. Cyan grinned slightly, looking ahead. Gilead thought Cyan was too careful, but thanks to this, he'd managed to avoid traps. This wasn't bad. Cell stood before the goblin. The goblin swung his sword at the girl. Cell deftly dodged the enemy's attack, briskly piercing the enemy's head. The goblin instantly evaporated. Cell ran on with a satisfied grin. A dead end appeared before the girl. She noted there was no passage there and would return to the last fork. Desira looked up thoughtfully. Gilead thought Cell had good perception and flexible thinking, but sometimes she behaved like a child. Yod looked at the goblin in confusion. The goblin smiled bloodthirstily, extending his sword. Yod looked at his opponent with admiration. It was incredible this monster was created with magic. The boy leaned to the side when the monster swung at him. The boy blocked the monster's blow and cut off the opponent's head with a sharp movement. The monster instantly disappeared. The boy looked with delight at the sparks from the magic. Roan looked thoughtfully at the joyful Yod, saying apparently he was very interested in magic. The head of the family closed his eyes and smiled slightly. Gilead said he'd been fascinated by it since childhood. Even professors of magic from the capital were invited to teach him, but he'd soon abandoned further studies. The head of the tower looked at the head of the family in bewilderment, asking why. Gilead remembered his first wife. He said he'd resigned himself to his fate and, for the sake of his mother, decided to become head of the family. But magic didn't give any advantage in the struggle for succession. The head of the tower looked straight ahead with a dejected expression. He said he understood it concealed endless possibilities, but the path to mastering it was also full of difficulties and dangers. Gilead said, however, he'd like him to cast aside his doubts and follow his destiny. The head of the family frowned, looking at Ryan. If the passion for magic hadn't yet subsided in his soul, he wouldn't refuse the offer to become his disciple in the Red Magic Tower. The head of the tower looked seriously at the head of the family. For his sake, he could take Yod into the tower, but if his abilities left much to be desired, he wouldn't take him as a disciple. The head of the family smiled slightly. He wasn't forcing him in any way, he just wanted his son to achieve his dreams. Gilead imagined a smiling Senya. It had come to the point that he, the descendant of the great Bermont, had great respect for the wise Senya. Ryan closed his eyes, imagining Senya's magic. He understood him perfectly in the heroic adventures of Bermont. He was always more interested in the stories about Mrs. Senya. Every time their company was in danger, she found an amazing way to deal with it using magic. The head of the family looked at Roan with a satisfied smile. He'd read this book since childhood, but to tell the truth, he liked another hero the most, not the great Bermont or the wise Senya. Roran looked at Gilead with curiosity, asking who. Gilead looked straight ahead with a grin, saying he liked him the most. Roan looked at the head of the family in surprise, asking what it was. Gilead told him to take a look. Gilead pointed his finger at the sphere. Eugene stood before a huge monster. The goblin swung his fist and hit the ground, but the protagonist dodged. The protagonist disappeared from the monster's sight. Eugene deftly struck the goblin over and over again. The tower head and Gilead looked at the boy in shock. Rorian asked who he was. Gilead looked at the protagonist in admiration. Incredible. Eugene landed on the ground, killing the monster. The protagonist looked straight ahead with a confident expression. Rorian said the name Eugene Lionheart. A huge monster lay behind the protagonist. The goblin instantly disappeared. Rorian and Gilead looked at what was happening, dumbfounded. Gilead smiled widely, asking how incredible it was. He was only 13 and had never encountered a troll before. Not only did he manage to keep his cool, but he also dealt with it bravely and without fuss. Roan looked straight ahead in bewilderment. Trolls weren't created to be fought, but as obstacles that must be passed through using loopholes. This one was also larger than real ones. He simply couldn't believe he'd defeated it so easily. Gilead smiled contentedly, looking at the head of the tower. Such a thing was also possible if the boy was born so capable. Rorion looked at the head of the family in confusion, asking if he knew what such children were called. Roan imagined Eugene with Bermont behind him. They were geniuses. The troll swung his fist. Gars blocked the blow with his sword. The blow sent him flying. Darwi landed on the ground, gritting his teeth. A huge troll stood before the wounded boy. The boy opened his mouth wide, screaming at the top of his lungs. He charged at the monster. The troll slammed into the ground as Gares swung his sword. The boy cut off the monster's leg with a furious look. The troll fell to the ground. Gares jumped into the air, swinging his sword. The boy plunged his sword into the troll's chest. The monster opened its mouth wide in wild pain. His hand was shaking. The troll's hand fell to the ground. Exhausted, Gares looked at the dead monster. He spread his arms wide and opened his mouth. The guy fell to the ground when the monster evaporated. Garu sat on the ground with a battered look, clenching his teeth while clutching his ribs. He thought its blows were able to pass through his favorite muscles and break his ribs. After all, these monsters were very strong. The guy weakly dragged the sword behind him. In addition to the endless traps, an encounter with a troll was added. If he was so battered, others were probably the same. Darar fell to the ground without strength. Cyan stood with a stone in his hand before the monster. Cyan looked at his opponent in shock. A troll, now stronger monsters were coming. Cyan frowned. It was just an obstacle on his way to his cherished goal. Cyan threw the stone to the side. The troll turned its attention to the sound. Cyan ran past the monster, looking back at the troll with a sly grin. He'd succeeded. Cyan continued running through the labyrinth. Cell looked ahead in shock, seeing her brother. Cyan's mouth fell open in surprise, seeing his sister. They stood opposite each other. Cell noted with a puzzled look they were still able to meet, although they'd started at different ends of the labyrinth. Her brother noted most likely the center was already close. They smiled enthusiastically when the brother praised his sister and asked her to follow him because he'd lead them out. Cyan furiously imagined how the main character had mocked him. He remembered how a few days ago, that idiot Eugene had humiliated him right in front of Cell. Now he had a chance to restore his honor. The guy looked at his sister with a sly smile when she wanted to ask him something. She dumbfoundedly widened her eyes. If the labyrinth was just an illusion, then could they run into any monster? In that case? She walked behind her brother, who answered in the affirmative and was surprised by her questions. She asked if ghosts could appear here. Cyan looked ahead with a dejected expression. He spread his arms to the side, asking what she was afraid of. He mockingly looked to the side, asking his sister not to worry no matter what happened to them. He'd deal with anyone with his sword. Suddenly, a bloody silhouette of a guy appeared before him. He screamed in horror. Cell watched as her brother screamed in fear along with Desira. Cyan pointed his finger in confusion, recognizing Desira and asking what she was doing here. She anxiously held her chest, explaining she was scared herself because Cyan had suddenly screamed. The guy spread his legs and became angry, asking the girl why she was covered in blood. She probably wanted to scare him first and then attack him unexpectedly. The girl stepped forward, answering she'd gotten hurt in one of the traps. She frowned angrily, realizing her surprise attack was covered. She immediately began to leave with an angry look. Cell immediately screamed to her brother that Desira wanted to run away. They immediately became angry, looking at each other. He realized because of this girl, he'd only embarrassed himself even more in front of his sister. He furiously frowned, not wanting to forgive the girl, and wanted to run in pursuit of Desira. They immediately began running after her. Desira angrily bared her teeth, realizing she alone couldn't cope with them. And where was her muscular friend Gargus? At this time, he was lying on the ground unconscious. The girl was horrified when she ran onto the crumbling slabs. She angrily bared her teeth, realizing she was trapped. She managed to run across the place where the floor collapsed, stepping onto the slabs and jumping over. Behind her, her brother and sister were running. Cyan looked ahead in surprise, realizing the floor had collapsed and it was too far to the other side. They'd most likely have to look for another way. His sister ran behind enthusiastically. He realized he couldn't allow himself to fall even more in Cell's eyes. He frowned furiously, realizing he'd been holding back before meeting the main monster, but now he'd show his strength. He ran forward angrily, his aura glowing, because he knew he'd have to use magic. He immediately sped up, wanting to jump over the trap. He immediately bounced off the ground. The guy deftly jumped over the trap, stepping onto the floor. He immediately extended his hand, asking his sister to jump after him. He'd catch her. Cell, under his magic, also jumped over the trap. Cell landed on the floor next to her brother. Cyan looked at his sister with a sly grin, noting he didn't expect anything less from her. The guy immediately pulled out his sword, saying they needed to continue. After that, the chase resumed. Eventually, Cyan, Cell, and Desira found themselves in the center of the labyrinth. The three stood near a huge monster. Desira and Cyan looked at the main monster in shock. The main character stood by the wall with his arms crossed, asking why the three of them came. Cyan looked back in amazement, not understanding what Eugene was doing here. The protagonist smiled sarcastically, crossing his arms. He wanted to know who'd be here first. All the boys looked back at the main character. When Cyan asked Eugene about his phrase, Cell looked at the main character and noted with confusion he'd come before them. The boy agreed. Bloody Desira squeezed her spear, asking about the fact he'd gotten to the center of the labyrinth first, but decided to wait. She also asked if this could somehow be considered as his agreement to their offer with Gargus to team up and destroy the main monster together. Eugene ironically scratched his ear, saying he remembered something like that. He replied it wasn't about that, but he simply decided to give in to them because he could easily cope with the monster alone. The main character mockingly scratched his cheek, adding they'd probably be offended because they'd put so much effort into being here. Cyan angrily clenched his fist, angry at such a statement. The protagonist pointed his hand at the monster, saying apparently this monster would start attacking only if you got close enough to it. In other words, it was in a state of waiting. The protagonist began waving his hand before the guys, saying they wouldn't fight in the same order in which they came here. Desira would go first, then Cyan, and Cell would be last. He considered this a fair decision. Desira widened her eyes in surprise they'd have to fight alone. Eugene raised his hand with a smirk, noting the girl had gotten pretty battered on the way here. If she thought she couldn't win, he suggested she give up in that case. Desira pulled out a white handkerchief, shouting she wouldn't give up. She immediately clenched her fists in anger. She went first while the others watched. Cyan looked at Eugene in bewilderment, asking if he really wasn't going to fight. The protagonist replied he'd go last. The guy continued looking angrily at Eugene, ironically asking if he really thought it would be his turn, hinting he'd be the one to defeat the main monster. The protagonist looked mockingly from under his brows, notifying that if Cyan succeeded, he'd call him Big Brother for the rest of his life. The blue-haired guy blushed, shocked. He grinned maliciously, noting Eugene wouldn't dare forget his promise later. Cyan decided to sit down on the floor. He sat with his sister while Eugene stood. He thought about the Minotaur monster, realizing it appeared in all the stories about labyrinths. The black bull minotaur frowned. While Cyan thought the monster was too big, even bigger than the troll he'd recently seen. He frowned at the various monsters, realizing minotaurs were distinguished only by their size. They weren't as aggressive as, for example, trolls or ogres, so he could easily defeat the bull alone. The bull continued to frown. Then it opened its eye furiously. The minotaur perked up when Desira approached it. The boys realized she'd have a hard time. The monster looked down on the little girl. She looked at the monster with horror, realizing he was huge and she needed to knock down such a big guy. He immediately got angry, baring his teeth, realizing she'd already gone so far and therefore there was no turning back. She immediately rushed to attack. She was immediately covered by the shadow of the monster's hand. Cell managed to jump back from the monster's blow. Then she dexterously somersaulted from place to place. The girl immediately stuck her spear into the minotaur's hand. The spear couldn't pierce the monster through and through. The girl looked at what was happening in shock, noticing such thick skin couldn't be pierced by her spear. Then the monster was about to grab the girl. The minotaur immediately squeezed her in his hand. Desira in the shackles of the monster bared her teeth, realizing her end had come. The minotaur immediately threw the girl as far away as possible. Desira rolled on the ground. Eugene looked at the defeated girl with Cell. The seated Cell looked at the protagonist, asking why the monster just threw Desira away and stopped attacking her. The protagonist looked ahead indifferently, explaining there was no real monster in front of them. After the minotaur grabbed her, it was clear the girl had lost. Cyan mockingly sharpened his blade, realizing it was his turn. Cyan sarcastically looked back at Eugene, declaring he'd now see that the side branches were a more powerful skill in whose veins the blood of the main family flowed. The protagonist smiled maliciously. Cyan angrily looked back, realizing Eugene was a scoundrel because he really thought he couldn't kill such a pathetic monster. The guy pulled out his sword, glowing with a blue aura. He wanted to prove to the main character he wasn't a mistake and would do everything beautifully. He tightly clutched his blade. Then he grinned sarcastically. Desira looked at the scene with alarm, realizing it was an all-pervading sword enhanced with magic. In order to create something like that, one would need to train for at least 10 years. Desira bared her teeth in anger, realizing they were already very far behind the main family. Cell looked at the main character, who exclaimed it would be quite good for Cyan. The boy held the blade with a sneer, realizing he wouldn't be able to maintain the magical energy of the sword for long, but he'd have enough time to cut the monster. Cyan then looked at the core from above with confusion. Eugene looked at Cyan as he waved the blade in confusion. The boy remembered how Gilead told him the meaning of this ritual was to prove he was worthy of being called the descendant of the great Vermont. It didn't matter whether he was from a direct branch or not. He remembered how Rorian used magic, realizing this labyrinth was her creation. He'd specially made it so magic couldn't be used in the center. Eugene realized with a malicious look, since it was impossible to strengthen the weapon with mana, then the children from the main and side branches could fight equally. Cyan looked confused, holding the sword because he didn't understand why the sword didn't obey him. He still had plenty of mana. The main character smiled mockingly near the wall, ironically noting for the guy that if he lost, he could go back. It wasn't worth acting rashly because of his stubbornness. Cell looked at her brother with admiration. Cyan bared his teeth angrily, wishing Eugene wouldn't mock him because he thought that without magic, he supposedly couldn't defeat this pathetic monster. The guy ran at the huge minotaur with screams. The minotaur reached out with his hand to grab the fighter. Cyan dodged deftly, damaging the monster. He continued to strike the monster multiple times. Cyan ran furiously to attack the monster, realizing such light wounds wouldn't bring it down. He should somehow plunge the sword deeper into the leg. The guy ran toward the monster's leg, looking at the leg with glee, thinking he'd succeeded. Right in front of him, The monster struck with its knee. Cyan bared his teeth furiously, realizing his attack was blocked by a knee strike. The Minotaur immediately grabbed the guy. The bull also threw Cyan far away. However, the agile Cyan managed to land on his feet. The main character looked at the dejected Cyan, saying he'd also lost. The blue-haired guy angrily looked back. Eugene looked at Cell, declaring she'd be next. The girl timidly crossed her fingers, replying she wouldn't go because the magic sword didn't work here. The protagonist looked away wearily, realizing the girl was smarter than her brother. Then he went to his equipment himself. He began putting the shield on his hand. Then he walked toward the monster while the others watched. The girl asked the protagonist if he could win. Eugene walked without looking back with his sword. He sharpened the blade with a sly grin, realizing he had to try very hard to lose. The Minotaur looked at the guy arrogantly. Eugene looked up mockingly, trying to figure out how he should kill the monster.